Hey there, welcome to episode 27 of the FFS Talk audio program. I'm your host, Dan Hugo, recording this in the mid-afternoon on Thursday, May 30th, 2024. I was almost going to begin recording before. On this day, just recently, the verdict was announced from New York, so I'll let you think back to today. An interesting time. It is a momentous point in history. It'll be interesting to see what comes of it. But it was about to go live, and I said, "Okay, I'll wait. See what the outcome was." That is not the topic of today's episode. We are going to speak today on monoliths and oligoliths. I made that word up, so I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce it. But oligoliths, monolith, oligolith. Something like that. If you are not familiar, FFS Talk is a complete audio program dedicated to discussing, sometimes a monolith of presentation, what works, what doesn't, and what we can do about it. If you are not familiar with what FFS stands for, you need to meet more Irish people. The show notes, hopefully located in the description for the episode you're listening to, wherever you found it, wherever you find your podcasts. I like the term audio program myself. Podcast is kind of tied to a product from a company. Audio program, a little bit more generic. Nowadays, people think podcasts are also video content, more of like an interview, talk show type format, usually. So I think some of the terminology has become a little bit blurred, or who knows. Anyway, let's get started. This, as usual, is a topic that would be great with others, a conversation, a discussion, maybe a debate. All of the episodes we've had throughout, today's episode 27, so at least that many, are all topics that would be worthy of discussion and debate. So none of these are off limits in the future. If someone, you perhaps, listening says, "Hey, I want to revisit that topic." So we'll see. And then there may be, speaking of video, I would very much like to bring on or add to the mix a sort of a live stream discussion type thing. We'll see what we can make happen through the summer of 2024, which is coming up fast, about 22 days, give or take. So let's get started for real this time. Show notes. I'm your host, of course, Dan Hugo. The summary of today's episode. What do we do when there is only one substantive choice, when the masses accept that choice, and then the one choice fails miserably? Failure could be failing the users, failing as a company or a business, failing to deliver on time. Could be any number of things. Do we go to the next most popular and make it the new one, and do that again, and then again, and so on? If it is possible to take back a modicum of agency, is it possible? Reading is hard. Is it possible to take back a modicum of agency and maybe autonomy into our uncertain futures? I should say take modicum. Anyway, maybe I'll edit that, maybe I'll leave it in. That is my written summary. I do prepare notes for episodes, especially when I'm solo, which has been all of my audio programs for the last many months, just so I don't do the and long pauses. So I've written out. I do typically read the summary, and then I see where the notes take me. The links as well, already written out, ready to go. Now, I will point out, today I'm not speaking of a monolith as an economic entity, although certainly monoliths play a role in the way I'm discussing them today. And oligoliths I'll get to in a second. So monolith is not the economic equivalent of a monopoly or a monopsony, but I do have links to those. So let's get started with the usual, though. Apparently, let's get started is in my head like a song. buymeacoffee.com/Dan Hugo. You're under no obligation to buy me any coffee, but I do use that as a one-page profile. You can buy coffee there if you like to support the various projects. It's like a link tree or similar. It's just a a page on which I can place links and description and sections of same. And I'm not totally thrilled with the editing and presentation of that profile page, but it is links. It's on a different platform that is commonly used by people doing this sort of thing, whether it's projects outside of media creation or various things. So low-hanging fruit, it does work for two things. One, as a way to promote my various projects and connect them all together on a platform that people use that I don't have to manage or deal with. So I can use my own websites, of course, and that's on the to-do list still this many decades later. But I can also make use of tools like this. And two, on the rare occasion that someone does want to quite literally buy me a coffee, all projects, as shown, powered by coffee. I even have some favorite coffee beans listed. The other, production by a street, the other usual suspect on this list, the Dan's Ko-fi profile page, ko-fi.com/Dan Hugo. I pronounce it Ko-fi to emphasize that it's Ko-fi, not to be confused with coffee, even though it's probably pronounced coffee. ko-fi.com/Dan Hugo. When I launch the individual websites for the primary point of publication for my various audio programs and then some other things, I will post announcements because the Ko-fi platform is basically more of an announcement tool than a profile tool. So 2 cups of coffee today, as usual. The actual links for the show, I have 4 Wikipedia links. I actually have 6. 4 Wikipedia links concerning the economic view that this episode is not specifically about, although they fit together. That will become obvious if it isn't. Monopoly, oligopoly, monopsony, and oligopsony. Everybody knows Monopoly. It's a fine board game, sort of. A monopoly is a single seller. I've monopolized the market. I'm the only seller, so people can only buy products from me. If I were the only game in town, if there's only one grocery store, if there's one gas station, they pretty much have a monopoly. Monopoly is one of those things that can happen in a quote-unquote free market capitalist economic system, because eventually the winner takes over the market. So they compete on price, or they kill their competition with loss leaders, or they acquire their competition, etc. So eventually the nature of a free market capitalist economy favors consolidation to one winner, and then it makes it more difficult for competition to enter the marketplace. So monopoly is something to always be aware of. It's something that gets talked about quite a bit. It is something that regulation and regulation and legislation, in fact, try to prevent, sometimes successfully, sometimes it takes a while. An oligopoly is similar, except that there's more than one seller. So you can have, I think, probably the example that I've heard more from, like the normal, pretty much ubiquitous example would be the gas stations on the corner. So if there's competing gas stations on each corner, but they all have the same price, they're all backed by big oil companies, they're all selling into the same market. So you don't really have much of a choice, but you have a choice of more than one, but not many more. And they all basically offer the same thing. There's really no product differentiation, and there's no price differentiation. Their prices are all basically the same. They may or may not be colluding. That would be not quite legal, but an oligopoly tends to have a similar impact on a monopoly unless they are destructively competing. Like I was saying, you can kill off your competition with loss leading. So you give your products away, so you sell them at a loss. You take your other players off the board, so to speak. But an oligopoly is where the players sort of reach a steady state and they compete. Sometimes one will be in the lead and one is not, and so on. So similar, slightly different. We always hear about monopoly Nobody ever talks about an oligopoly, although you do hear the word oligarch way too frequently now. A monopsony, you never hear that term. A monopsony is when there is an oligopsony is R. A monopsony is when there is one buyer. So monopoly seller, monopsony buyer. This great example is a company town. So everybody works for the car manufacturer. Everybody works for the everybody works at the agricultural company. Everybody works at the whatever it is. So there's only one major employer in town. They're buying your services as an employee. So they're paying you. You're not paying them, hopefully. And so in a monopsony, there's a similar market impact, right? There's no choice. And in an oligopsony, there are few employers. So I know in Hillsboro, Oregon, where Intel is located, I have heard this from my former colleagues at Intel. I've been up there. They've said to me very explicitly, well, if I leave Intel, I guess I can only go to Nike. And I like Nike just fine. But there is a limited, if you are a experienced, been around the block a few times, employee, especially if you are into technology, the only other game in town at that size, so potentially at that salary level and, salary benefits and so on, is Nike. Just do it. So something of an oligopsony in that case. I don't know that they are aggressively pursuing any of the benefits, maybe. But either way, these four modes of operation for a marketplace are often referred to. That's not really what I'm talking about today, although monolithic vendor, service providers, design, any entity that sort of takes a high position, a position of some sort of authority or majority in a marketplace, can very easily become one of the one or one of in any of these four modes of operation of a free market. So free, quote unquote, free market. So I mention them here just so that there's a reference point. But a monolith, I'm kind of using that off the norm. Monolithic projects, monolithic repositories, one big thing that gets all the attention. Doesn't mean there can't be other players. So I'm going to have a list of examples. If I say McDonald's is a monolith, you could say, well, Burger King and Wendy's and Carl's Jr. This is true. But a monolith, in my use of it here today, is a substantial element or a component of a marketplace or of a ecosystem, so that the monolith maybe has disproportionate influence. That is in a room with McDonald's, Burger King, Wendy's, Carl's Jr., various other, Subway. Can I think of Arby's, Popeyes, Chick-fil-A? So there's any number of smaller players. One of the individuals in the room can say, well, we are the largest buyer of all of our ingredients. We basically move the markets when we buy onions or when we buy buns. So that's how I'm viewing this, as the monolith in a particular marketplace. And there could be multiple monoliths. There could be, Apple and Google when it comes to cell phones. Mobile phones are basically down to two players, so two monoliths. And so that's why I've created the term today, invented here for you. Oligoliths. So oligopsony, oligopoly, oligoliths. So just think of it as multiple monoliths. They could interoperate. So for example, a Google phone and an Apple phone can talk to each other. Sometimes that becomes a huge issue, whether you get a blue or a green bubble or something, but basically they interoperate. So they're not trying to kill each other. They're servicing their particular markets. They're competing against each other for, taking one customer from one, moving them to the other, etc. But for the most part, they maintain their market share, and they try to acquire new market share. But they interoperate. They don't try to completely destroy, because that has a detriment. Here's the fun part. all of the people using your competitor's device probably want to talk to the people using your device at some point. So if you make their life impossible, if you destroy them, there will be a refractory period where most of your customers will say, what'd you do that for? I can't call my mom, or I can't do business. So it's kind of tricky. And plus the government would step in and all kinds of problems would ensue. So we'll get to all that. The information silo, I will link to that. Information silos can form, whether we like it or not. Sometimes they just emerge. But if you maintain your dominance in a marketplace, some of that dominance will come in the form of keeping your information, keeping your cards close to your vest, as they say. The keeping information private, not necessarily sharing, not always interoperating, those green and blue bubbles, for example. So information silos are a thing, and so monoliths will tend to sort of almost automatically end up with information silos where they don't necessarily share fairly or appropriately or maybe legally. Sometimes they share too much and they don't know it until after. And that's another problem we'll get to. So information silos are a thing in in consideration of how we interact with monoliths. And I'll stop saying oligoliths because I'm not exactly sure how to say it, but just imagine, and the artwork for the cover art for today's episode is more than one monolith. So you can view that as multiple monoliths or as an oligolith, up to you. I have a link to the Wikipedia page for 2001: A Space Odyssey because if I say the word monolith, I'm going to assume that you immediately imagine the opening of that movie, not the immediately opening scene, but the first act, certainly the first part of the first act. Monolith appears, somewhat ominous. Another monolith on the moon. I don't want to spoiler alert. There's a lot of monoliths out near Jupiter. I'll leave it there so I don't spoil too much. So the monolith appears on its own and then with some friends. I think it's the word that comes to mind most easily for people who've seen the movie. And it's become a cultural meme, the monolith from 2001. Most people will know what that means. So it's an interesting visualization because it's closer to what I'm talking about than the market side. So I left it in. The Paradox of Choice is a book and a concept. I'm not sure which came first. The Paradox of Choice is when you have too many choices. The assertion in this book, and I think it's generally true, if there are too many choices, you introduce anxiety to your customers. I've seen an example of Netflix. There's so many movies on Netflix that which one do you want to pick? Oh, I don't know. I want to see all of them, but I don't even know which one. I don't know. I'll just go outside. Yeah, that's going to happen. Something similar has been said of something like Baskin Robbins with their 31 choices of ice cream. It's 31 too many. If you walked into an ice cream store and they had vanilla, chocolate, strawberry, a nice Neapolitan mix, would that make the choice easier? Would you just, I'll just go with the chocolate, or I'll try all three. But if it's 31 different flavors, is that too many? If it's 100, is it too many? Do you end up picking none? My assertion here would be that the paradox of choice is a motivating factor for everyone sort of rallying around the popular choice. And so when on the company side, if they're developing a monolithic strategy, like we want to dominate the market head and shoulders above any other, we want to hold 86% or whatever it is for the Gmail holds of the email user market, mailer user agents, I guess. No, if that is the strategy, then you will feed, at least in the first third of your overall strategy, if Cory Doctorow is to be believed, and I've already linked to Cory's article on TikTok and how everything gets bad over time. So I won't do it again here, but if you know, you know. So if you initially begin to just give your users what they want because you want to capture market share and take it from others, then maybe you are feeding directly into what people need and or want. And the paradox of choice can be factored out quickly. Like, which one should I choose? Twitter Vines, Instagram Reels, YouTube Shorts, TikTok, whatever, TikToks. Snapchat, whatever that is, and maybe there were other players. Oh, there's so many. I have to have accounts on each one. And some people do that because they're crazy. But, eventually there's a kind of a de facto winner that everybody goes, oh, well, of course you have, it's probably TikTok from all indications. So, of course, you have to have TikTok and then maybe Instagram. So Instagram delivers threads. Like, oh, now you have to automatically have threads and follow everybody. And so they introduce new things to make them essential so they can enter the monolith status. Because, well, we got to have that. And so everybody agree. Yeah, we all have to have that. We don't have to choose. There's no paradox of choice to enter the picture because everyone is sort of implicitly agreed. Like, well, yeah, you got to have the one that everybody else has. And if everybody says that at the same time, it's true. So the paradox of choice, I always found the concept kind of interesting. When there's an embarrassment of riches, you get a paradox of choice. It's easier to make one choice between 3 items than 30. So the ominous part to begin, and again, if you happen to see 2001, you have some sense of the menacing impact a large monolith might have over you and those around you. At first, it might seem like, ooh, what is this? What is this new, when Google launched Gmail, it was a crazy rug. Give me a beta invite. And it was a curiosity, and it was really buggy, and it was weird. So it wasn't yet apparent that it was a monolith, but it would soon be, and it has become. And that's not always a great thing. So sometimes a monolith doesn't come on the scene as it does in 2001, fully formed and ready to go. Sometimes maybe, especially if there's like a merger or if there's an acquisition that suddenly elevates a startup to like, oh, we have the resources to take over the world. It could be argued that OpenAI has potential there because of the ginormous Microsoft investment. They already had some money. That remains to be seen. But a large monolith could end up being menacing. You may not notice it immediately. You may be thinking, ooh, that first phase of customer acquisition and marketplace dominance is very attractive. And we'll see what happens in phase 2 when they start favoring their advertisers and other real customers. So monolith implies a single structure or thing, a vendor, a product, usually a company that makes the product. There can be multiple monoliths. That's why I have the reference links to the 4 sort of most common market labels. The players in each of those modes tend to be monoliths. So if you have a monopsony, the multiple buyers of things, whether it's labor or agricultural products or whatever it is, they tend to be the monoliths in the room. So they're the big giant players that too big to fail sometimes applied here. If you're wondering, oh, where are my local banks now? Is there even anything other than Bank of America and Wells Fargo? You can go local. You should bring back postal banks, but that's a previous episode. So I've created a new word, like I said, oligoliths. Oligoliths. So I misspelled the word here. Multiple monoliths in a marketplace that have an impact, and so they probably co-opetition oriented. They either cooperate, in which case they would risk collusion, so they always have to also compete. So co-opetition, not only economically but socially and technologically and so on. So they are probably trying to lead each other on innovation that will have effects later on their place in the market and their own economics and what people think of them and all that. So they're always, the big players will always be competing on more than just one thing. Ultimately, if they're a public company, they have fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders. So that's the ultimate, you could say, KPI. But they're probably trying to compete on, I mean, if you look at the Google I.O. presentation, if you are so inclined, or if you look at the OpenAI product launch that coincidentally came right before Google I.O., you will see there's a lot put into shiny announcements, very identifiable, very exciting, not necessarily technologically complete, not always completely useful in the practical sense, but they sure look good for a presentation. So what do we have today? If we simply look around the news headlines and the real world outside our window, so sometimes this is an absolutely partial list. I literally just rattled off some things that came to mind, and if you look in the news, some of these make news a lot, especially the first one. We have, so I'm speaking as a person who lives in Las Vegas, Nevada, in the United States, on Earth. So we have one domestic commercial aircraft manufacturer, essentially, Boeing, and there are two major manufacturers globally. There are certainly manufacturers in other countries. They don't have quite the stature, the established track record, which Boeing is chipping away at itself. But of course, Airbus being the arguably number two, but I don't know who ranks those. But certainly Boeing, Airbus, two monoliths. But we have one domestically. One military aircraft manufacturer domestically that kind of has to be domestic. That'd be Lockheed. If there's a cool airplane coming, hitting the headlines and not getting any attention on a radar screen, it must be from Lockheed. One fast food restaurant that buys all the ingredients. I already mentioned McDonald's. And again, this is monolithic status. So is Chick-fil-A up there? Sure. Is Popeyes up there? Yeah. Is Burger King, Wendy's? Yep. Carl's Jr., Hardee's. These are all also fast food restaurants, but McDonald's has a weird role to play in the world in multiple ways, which I'll touch on later. One major online email service provider, Google, which I described briefly. If Google Gmail goes away, there will be problems. What will happen with all that spam? But yeah, Google has an unfortunate influence over the way email works, over who will receive your email through their various spam filters. They recently rolled out DMARC, the DMARC, right? For official policy on bulk mailing, like, what is it? Errant delivery. I can't remember exactly, but DMARC is another layer of trying to cut down on spam from bulk emailers. That's on top of DKIM, domain key internet mail, I think it is, and SPF, Sender Policy Framework. So these are all connected to domain name service, DNS records, to authenticate sender that, so you can't spoof email servers, sort of. So Google, on the upside, if they implement it, it's implemented. You don't have to wait for a million different mail delivery agents to work through all these implementations and rollouts and all that, and debugging. On the other hand, if Google decides to roll out a new policy that affects bulk emailers, that has unintended consequences if you rely on mailing your tenants for big property management companies, or mailing your patients from a hospital. If they're, even if their email provider is Gmail, I'm sorry, even if their email provider is not Gmail, you cannot guarantee that the way you've configured your mail server is still functional, because they may have rolled out new policies to cut down on spam. And if you are a bulk email sender, you may get caught up in that. Sounds like the voice of experience in the last 2 months. So I've been checking my spam more proactively and finding not spam in there. And Google's not good at reporting error reasons. So we have two major grocery store chains in the United States, Albertsons Group, and that's thanks to various consolidation efforts. And then Kroger, which has various nameplates under it, Ralph's, Fry's, Smith's. Strangely enough, Kroger wants to buy Albertsons, or they want to merge. I can't remember if it was, I can't remember who would come out on top of that. But either way, Kroger is number one right now, so probably Kroger is trying to acquire Albertsons. This would make certainly one big giant grocery monolith. You get all the economies of scale and then all of the price issues. Then, when you get a monopoly, one monolith in one monopoly. Two major mobile device platforms, Google and Apple. So if you want to get a third one, hopefully you like Linux on your mobile device, and hopefully you're good with it sort of working. And as someone who has worked on a Linux-based cell phone, the Palm Pre, I will say I would go for a Linux phone as my secondary device and totally migrate over to it and hang on to one of the other ones. I have an Android device right now. Hang on to Android for the couple of things that might not work yet, but I would go all in on a Linux phone. But for the fact I'm not a global traveler anymore, so I don't need to always have a phone in an airport in parts unknown. If I did, though, I would totally begin my migration to a Linux phone. Windows used to have a Windows Mobile. Feature phones are making a comeback, but still at the end of the day, Google and Apple, tremendous market share that they split in some way, depending on day of the week. But two major players, incompatible operating systems, of course, so the burden goes to the developers. 3 credit check services. There are some other ones that probably aim more for commercial, like business credit checks. But if you are an individual person in the United States, maybe elsewhere, you will almost certainly have heard of Equifax, Experian, and TransUnion. At least one of those has had a major security breach where all of your data was leaked out. Probably all 3 of them have multiple times over the years. We may or may not have heard about them. They may not even know about them. So you have these 3 monoliths who maintain explicitly way too much data about individual people that has far too much of a consequential impact on their lives, financially and maybe otherwise. And who knows what's going on with the data that they actually maintain with authority. I know they've outsourced hosting and support of some of their services. So it's not always clear which laws apply to who is taking what and so on. So that's something to be aware of. One or two, there are more, but 1 or 2 internet service providers of note. Comcast always gets all the attention. Cox, COX, also a ginormous player. And then there are some smaller, sometimes slightly smaller, but this comes into play when you're talking about access to a competitive marketplace, because internet access changing very, very slowly, but mostly not really regulated as it could be. So you're, hey, there's another provider of wired internet access, so we don't have to improve our services any more than they do. So it's kind of a dodge. Globally, America, United States has less substantial internet infrastructure when it comes to wired internet. Probably something similar for wireless, but we'll see how 5G and then 6G drive adoption. And with the BEAD program from the federal government to provide much more access to those in suburban and mostly rural areas who don't have any access, funding is being made available to increase that access. We'll see how Cox and Comcast continue as monoliths, but it would be difficult to argue that they are not, especially Comcast. And when it comes to headlines about screwing over their customers, overcharging, misrepresenting caps and rates and so on, Comcast is right up there. 2 or 3 mobile carriers near you, you are probably using right now, and you may not even know it, T-Mobile, AT&T, and or Verizon. Back in the day, Verizon was CDMA, AT&T was GSM 1900, I think. And T-Mobile was GSM 850 and 1800 or something. So there's all different radio standards, all incompatible. Now G5, Gen 5, 5th generation cell phones are all supposed to be interoperable, sort of, but there are still channels. Either way, thanks to some consolidations, T-Mobile purchased Sprint, AT&T, who did they buy? I can't remember. Verizon is still Verizon. There are some smaller players that basically sublet bandwidth and services from these players, and I can't remember the acronym, but end of the day, it's pretty much one of these 3 monolithic mobile carriers. Sometimes convenient. It was convenient for the European Union, Europe in general, to all standardize on GSM 900 megahertz until it wasn't. One major search engine. Now there are many search engines, tons. You can write your own search engine, and the advent of LLMs for the masses means I literally just read an article the other day, how to build your own local search engine so you're not sharing what you're searching for with anyone. So you're doing your own site spidering and robot consumption and analysis and so on. So there are many options. However, an embarrassment of riches yet? Maybe. But there's still one major search engine. When you say search for something on the internet, there's really no follow-up question. It's pretty much Google. And we will see soon what they do with that, given the sort of cataclysmic shift in generative AI and what people are doing with it. One major online video media provider, YouTube, also Google. Google owns YouTube. Technically, I think Alphabet owns YouTube. But either way, yes, there's Twitch and Floatplane and Rumble. There are a lot of platforms out there, but YouTube has the entire infrastructure, has the capacity and the finances available to continue to grow. Sure, TikTok is coming up. TikTok may launch a competitor to YouTube full-length content, but at the end of the day, YouTube is pretty entrenched. Yeah, TikTok is pretty entrenched on the short attention span theater, but YouTube is certainly a monolith in this space. There are two political parties. Do we even need to go there? There are many political parties, but there are really only two monoliths. They have unparalleled, almost unbreakable hold on debates, elections, etc. So that's a partial list. There are so many. Monoliths have doubtless influence, sometimes total control over marketplaces, over choice, over features. What do they choose to implement? I didn't really mention, obviously, Google also has their Chrome browser. Chrome is where they experiment with the standards that they're going to either impose on people or choose to support or not. So if Chrome doesn't support it, Google might not support it. And then if you have a better way of doing something, but Google doesn't buy into it, nobody's ever going to use it. So Google has sort of become a de facto monolith in the web browser market. And we've been here before. I worked at Netscape back in the day when Microsoft was being Microsoft with Internet Explorer. Can't we all just get along? There's a whole organization called W3 that's supposed to make sure we have open web standards, not proprietary one company to rule them all. The economic implications tend to be more obvious. People always talk about the monopoly or the other three. When you think about monoliths, so when you think about Google, when you think about Meta, Facebook, when you think about Amazon, you're always thinking their monopoly power, but there are other implementations that come with being a monolith. So you can be a monolith or marketplace that's, and you're behaving in a monopolistic manner. You can play with your pricing and access and who gets what, and your privacy policies may not be so friendly, but hey, we're the only game in town. What are you going to do? News coverage, attendance at congressional hearings, and press releases to address faux outrage are what you end up with, because that's what everybody's paying attention to. The economic implications reinforce the notion that our monoliths are permanent, that they're not going anywhere, too big to fail. Immovable objects. Unfortunately, they can and do fail, and there may not be another monolith waiting in the wings. And I'll get to some of in the next section. In fact, changes, fails, and backups. By the way, you can hear my voice is still arguing with me severely with the allergy season in Vegas going full. It's really hot, so it isn't quite as windy. I'm really hoping this is winding down, so we'll see. Changes, fails, and backups. So when we rely on a big player, a big monolith, to own a market segment or to compete with one or two others with dominance ping-ponging between them. So maybe Comcast is bigger today. Maybe next week it'll be Cox. It doesn't change that fast. But essentially, the two, we assume they're going to stay there, especially because they have a lot of investment in physical infrastructure, coaxial cable and whatever else they got going on, fiber. So will Google Fiber come and displace them? Probably not. Not in the near term. What is Google good at? shutting things down, usually their own things. So dominance ping-ponging between them, but maybe there's one dominant player. Generally, we need to keep an eye out for big changes that may not have your interest in mind. So they may decide to change. One example that is not bad, but I received an email. I have a Cox cable modem. Works pretty well. I have really very few, if any, complaints. I got an email that they're raising the upload bandwidth cap. There's a natural cap because of the way signaling works, but I guess they're able to raise the artificial cap. So I think it tripled in speed or something crazy. Like, I think it was 35 megabit up. I think now it's like 100. So that's almost too much, but I guess I should start getting some video streaming going, uploading. So these changes can be positive, but they can be negative. Now, the unintended consequences are maybe if everybody's using, now cable modems share bandwidth. So if everyone in your neighborhood is suddenly using 100 megabits upload speeds to do whatever with their webcams or talk shows, podcasts, reaction videos, whatever, they may, and if they're doing it live, right? You can always upload a pre-recorded video, and it can pause. It can put up with bandwidth pauses and traffic and so on. But if you're streaming live and everybody's doing it, then you ultimately will sort of cannibalize the total bandwidth. So that may be an unintended consequence. By removing a cap, you may be leading to a less positive user experience. But if we take Google and pick on them, since they are in too many things right now, if they decide Google does kill products, like I said, if they decide to kill a product or service on which you rely, I know this has happened to me many times over the years. Google Reader, do you have a backup? Do you have an alternative that you can switch to? Google Podcasts was just discontinued. They've officially sent out the final email. If you had a Google Podcast account, so my various programs were available through Google Podcasts, you got to move over to YouTube. So that's their version of a backup. What's the alternate? If you were depending on Google Podcasts, you may say, I guess I'll switch over to YouTube Podcasts. And then you say, this is not as good, not as useful, doesn't fit into how I was consuming podcasts. Maybe I'll switch to Spotify or something, Amazon, various other players. And then the upside about podcasting, audio programs, ideally, and I say this at the beginning of my shows frequently, wherever you find your podcast, that is also good or bad. There is no, despite what Spotify would like to have you believe, there's not necessarily one source monolith for what you would traditionally call a podcast. And the new way is video streaming on YouTube or TikTok, but the traditional, as invented many years ago by Adam Curry and perpetuated by the likes of Mark Maron and Joe Rogan and tons of other players who've been around for many years. You can find podcasts anywhere. That's the beauty of syndication. RSS 1.0, perhaps 2.0. I don't know about that, but RDF site summaries made possible the sharing of links to audio files, and the sort of decentralized podcast distribution potential network was born. And so where you get your podcast can vary wildly and hopefully vastly. Like hopefully you have many choices where you can find it. And hopefully if where you find your audio programming, if a particular program, maybe this one, is not available, hopefully you can find other places. Although what I tend to see is more cross-pollination. That is, you just start picking up RSS files or RSS feeds from various services, and you can link. The nice thing is you can usually link to the audio file without having to move the audio file. So you're just copying around links. So it works nicely. So if Google decides to kill off a product, you have a backup in mind so that your monolith doesn't really have your best interests. They're thinking, that service is not making us money. Let's kill it off. What if you are really bought into the Android ecosystem and Google decides, we're we're going to keep Android around, but we're going to not focus so much on new technology development in our devices. We're going to offload that to third parties. So now you got to buy a Samsung phone, and Samsung phones have not really kept up. They used to be, I had a Galaxy 2, an amazing device. Everything I'm reading now says they're not quite up to the old days. But if Google were to decide, we're just getting out of the Pixel market, we're done. We don't want to sell hardware. Hardware is expensive and hard. We'll just sell the software. The margins on software are tremendously better. Okay, so now you got to decide what you're going to do. So your monolithic service provider of all things mobile phone, hardware, and software decides to change its mind. What about Gmail? What if Google decides, we're not going to do Gmail the way we've been doing it? Not just the filtering I've suggested, but maybe we're going to start charging for anything over, which they've already been doing. Used to be unlimited disk space. Don't ever delete anything. And now that they've got everybody hooked, it's like, okay, now you should start deleting something, or you can pay a couple bucks a month. Yeah, that worked out. So what if Gmail doesn't have to disappear, although Google is want to do that, but these policy changes, pricing changes, tiered services, etc. Are you going to change your mail provider? Yeah, that's going to be fun. What if Google decides to go all in on AI and makes all of its products subpar demonstrations of its attempts to replace you writing your own documents or emails or visiting other websites? What if that's actually happening? We don't even have to guess. It is happening. The Gemma project, the Astra project, the things that they announced at Google I/O are essentially, we'll just generate a summary of the websites that you were going to visit, but now you don't have to. By the way, this is something that used to differentiate Facebook and Google, like the obvious hard differentiation. Facebook wants you to stay on Facebook. Google literally gives you a list of links where you should go somewhere else. So it was a question of stickiness. So now Google may be deciding, instead of sending you to other websites, we will read those websites for you and summarize them. And you may or may not have heard about this anecdotally, putting glue on pizza or eating rocks or whatever else they're coming up with. So not going great. But these things can happen. What do you do in that case? If Google is your monolith, your go-to, and you're in the Google ecosystem, you can say the same about Amazon. If you're all in on the Amazon ecosystem, if you're surrounded by Amazon devices that respond at the inopportune times to normal words, what are you going to do when they decide we're no longer supporting the old voice stuff? We're all in on AI, and it's going to cost you an extra $20 a month or $19.99. What if you're hooked on Prime and they decide they're going to keep raising the price every year? I think that happened already. So when you get too hooked into your own monolith, like, Amazon, everything Amazon is great for me. Wait, what? The prices are doubled? I got to pay more for something I already paid for? You're changing the terms without, it's a one-sided term change. That's not fair. So Google can do it, Amazon can do it. These big giant monoliths that are super monoliths, they're even bigger because they have so many integrated services and they've offered you so much value during their impoopification timeline. Now they are so powerful, they don't even need to worry about upsetting you. Like, we're just going to charge you more money. So kind of a little rant, but I can't see that you're disagreeing. So I'm looking at you right now. So let's move on to the final bullet item in this section. Often a change of plans for the sake of fiduciary responsibility to the shareholders, which eventually is the only thing that matters. So profit for your shareholders. So if you make that profit by screwing over your advertisers in phase 3 of the impoopification timeline, so be it. You're making money for the shareholders. And by the way, the management team is shareholders. Or some sort of systemic failure. So it could be an internal, whoopsie, forgot to upgrade that one server. Could be supply chain, could be all manner of things. Not just technology companies. It could be any big monolith. Could be, a big giant virus has attacked all onion production in the United States. So now McDonald's can't put onions on their quarter pounders with cheese. They'll have a chaotic impact on those who depend on monolithic providers. So if you are hooked on the Big Mac or the quarter pounder, and I can have neither the rehydrated minced onions, nor the diced normal onions on my quarter. What am I supposed to do? I'm going to have to go to Burger King, and then Burger King says, we don't have onions either. So then what do? I got to have my onions. So monolithic providers of goods or services that go away, you have to consider what you're going to do next. Now, McDonald's wouldn't go away, but one of their products would go away. That would impact their sales. They may have to shut some stores down and lay people off. There may be price changes involved. I don't know how else that could happen. When the failure in question revolves around a so-called black box that users do not fully understand, then you don't know exactly what to expect. Like, what is going to happen in the longer term with no more onions for a while? What's going to happen to my favorite McDonald's or Burger King or any store that would depend on this particular part of their supply chain? So if you are dependent on monoliths, we're not talking monopoly, we're not talking monopsony, we're talking about the monolithic entity and its various impacts, right? On the food you buy, maybe you're working at McDonald's, maybe somebody in your family is working at McDonald's, maybe McDonald's is providing something in the way of like a sponsorship or a donation or supporting some sort of a local effort. The McDonald's House, for example, the Ronald McDonald House. So there may be ripple effects in these things from these monolithic companies that have so many tendrils extended into other products and services in different places, sometimes unexpected. Look who owns Burger King one of these days, or Taco Bell. They got all kinds of stuff going on. And then you look at outside forces. So there may be consequential changes to the marketplace, the economy, regulation. Fundamentally, after the monolith you depend on, they could change. They might have to change directly or indirectly. There could be geopolitical changes, for example. Maybe you make and sell cell phones, but some other place decides you're not allowed to anymore. Maybe broad supply chain issues like availability of those onions changes drastically and quickly. Maybe it's the weather, or maybe it's an onion virus, H1N1. But maybe other causes, sometimes short term. So weather, like a storm that takes out a crop. This has been known to happen here and there. Global pandemics, I hear those can have some serious impact on especially smaller companies. They'll change the nature of the bigger companies, shifting more power to them possibly. There are long-term supply chain issues like climate change. If you are a coffee drinker, and I think I've probably made it clear that I enjoy a cup of coffee now and then, coffee may be running into some trouble. Chocolate, cocoa's been having some pricing issues due to availability. Whether cocoa will continue to be available as it has been, or if the prices will go up due to supply and demand, remains to be seen, but certainly coffee has a weird future ahead of it. Anything that depends on stable climate may be changing. And that's, again, just a very brief list, but these are things that can have a substantial impact on your monolith. Sometimes it makes them bigger and stronger, but sometimes that impact, the negative impact, will come later. You can see it primarily in the layoffs that all of the big companies, all the big monoliths, they've decided, all that pandemic hiring we did and all the remote workers and all these big plans, they're not making the money to satisfy the investors. And so if we need money and we need it from our investors, got to keep them happy. So we need to reduce our workforce, get back to profitability, lower the risk, lower the exposure. So the monoliths are going to pretend to be as big, but they're laying off people. So the unintended consequence of big success and leveraging challenging circumstances like a global pandemic and lockdowns and all this is eventually a refractory period. Headlines today concerning recent legally required increases for minimum wages paid to some employees, especially fast food workers for some reason, particularly those working fast foods in California, bring about two problems. But one is getting attention now. One will come later. In the short term, so right now, and they were talking about it even before the minimum wage increase was actually enacted, and I cannot remember which day that was, but I want to say it's about $20. Could be could be 15, but I think it's 20 in California. And there are parameters like if a restaurant or a particular employer, and it might be limited to fast food if you have more than some hundreds of locations nationally. So it's basically a scaling. How big is your monolith, right? So if you are a certain size, which personally I would take issue with because a lot of McDonald's locations are franchises. So how is that constructed? I have not read their legislation, but you're essentially required to pay a minimum wage to your employees of, I believe it's $20 in California. It's more than $8.25. It's certainly more than the national minimum wage, which was $7.25. I think it's supposed to go up soon. I can't remember. So in the short term, you're going to see, because the fiduciary responsibility is to the shareholders, when you got to pay more for wages, so your labor costs go up. So you have to raise your prices because you certainly don't want to eat into profits. You got to keep those investors happy. So you got to raise your prices. This will drive sales volume down because higher prices will mean fewer people coming to buy. Some people will still come in, but less often. Fewer people will come in at all. So your sales volume will go down. Your revenue will fall. Workforce numbers will have to be reduced because now they don't have to serve as many customers, and you will stabilize your profits. So you're charging more, you're serving less, you're paying out less for wages. So your labor costs go down, your inventory costs go down, your revenues go down. But if you do all the adjustments correctly, you end up stabilizing your profit. And really, at the end of the day, McDonald's, and we're picking on McDonald's in this case, McDonald's really makes their money at the corporate level by renting, being a landlord to their franchisors. That is something that Matt Pat covered on his food theory YouTube program, and I've discussed this elsewhere in any one of my 4 productions. But so it's a little bit more complicated than labor costs when it comes to a company like McDonald's. If you look at Little Caesars, Matt Pat also did a really interesting video on that about how Little Caesars really makes their money as a supply chain provider, I guess. They deliver all the ingredients, so they make the money on the supply chain to their various franchises. I don't know if they also make money on the rent, but they are not necessarily beholden to per store profitability to continue drawing in money. So it's the franchisees who have to do some fast moves just in case to make sure they're making the rent, but also keeping the store open, but not paying too many people too much money. So it becomes a weird phase that will have to reach a different kind of stability, hopefully in the near term, for their sake. I got to be honest, I haven't been to McDonald's in, I'm going to say 2 years, maybe 3 years. It's been a while. But in the medium and long terms, McDonald's is something of a monolith. I myself, now it wasn't my first job, but when I was 15 years old in high school, my job, I think it was like my second or third job. My family owned a restaurant. So I worked at McDonald's. I worked in the McDonald's in the Metro Center Mall in Phoenix. So I think I worked there for a year, and it was a good experience. Not great. I still ate McDonald's food after that for some reason. That was probably the worst part of it. Like, I should know better. But again, haven't been there in a while. But in the medium term, it becomes more difficult for young, inexperienced workers. And by the way, when I was hired, I was making, wait for it, $3.25 an hour. And I eventually, over the course of a year, got raises in the 10 and 15 cent and 25 cent variety. And I believe I was making $3.85 an hour when I departed for greener pastures. So in that context, but in the modern day, so I'm 15 years old, I technically had restaurant experience, but if I had no experience, but there's someone sitting next to me in the waiting room for interviews who has been in the restaurant business for a couple of years. Maybe they've worked on a food truck. Maybe they've worked in a Burger King. Maybe they worked at a Wendy's a bit before the minimum wage increase. So now they've got 1, 2, 3 years in different work environments, different types of work, doing the cooking, doing the customer service, doing the maintenance, whatever they're doing in different roles, different companies. So they're sitting next to me and they're, like, okay, we got to pay one of you $20 an hour. How do you think that's going to go? So where people get their first job when they're in high school or young, when they have very little experience or no experience, they got to get that summer job, probably won't be at McDonald's. Well, there are other jobs that can be had, but sometimes they're not. I mean, I got to be honest. When I worked at McDonald's, it was, can you do anything? Because there's a job for you here to do whatever it is you can do. You can do that at McDonald's. Can you mop a floor? Can you wipe a tray? Can you prepare food? Can you take money? Can you count back change? That's a big one. Can you carry boxes? Do you want to be the maintenance person? Do you want to clean out grease traps? Like, there's something for everyone at McDonald's. And this is true in most restaurants, right? There's always more to do than anyone really knows. So by increasing the minimum wage, the monolith that is McDonald's, not only as a customer-facing restaurant, purveyor of fast foods, but as an employer for many people getting their first job when they're very young and inexperienced, and that becomes less likely. And if you look around today on May 30th, 2024, you will start to see some articles coming out about the unintended consequences of the minimum wage increases in California. So the unintended impact on the monolith that we all have come to kind of understand and accept, right? Like, I can't imagine you're going to go to McDonald's and be surprised by most of the McDonald's experience. So, and that includes, of course, you're going to run into like everybody there is in high school. Maybe the manager is a senior in high school. That's a true story, by the way. Jenny, I remember Jenny was a crew chief or something at McDonald's. She would be the manager on the floor sometimes. And I ran into her at her high school because we were doing a function. I was in ROTC at the time. We were doing like a color guard or something during their graduation or whatever it was. And they're, oh, hey, Jenny, how's it going? She's graduating from high school. So you could be at a business establishment with the oldest person in the room is 18, right? So that's going to have to change. So the monolithic early employer notion, that element of the McDonald's presence on the planet, may be going through a substantial change in the near term, and that's something to be aware of, because that has a ripple effect on all the non-monoliths who might be saying, "Oh, now we can hire more high school students," but the job skill requirements will be different, and so the possible pool of employees doesn't really grow that much. Well, it remains to be seen. Who knows? I'm not going to predict anything right now. But the nature of the monolith in this case is changing when you're a high school student looking for a job. And that may apply to any number of fast food restaurants. I'm only picking on McDonald's mostly because of it is the big player, but also because I worked there a long time ago. Oh, maybe I can get a job at McDonald's. I'll have to check that out. I don't know I think minimum wage in Vegas is still $2, but you have to pay with a $2 bill. So if we continue to depend on our go-to goods and services providers, even when it comes to getting our first jobs, we will need to be aware that circumstances can change drastically sometimes due to unintended consequences. And again, these could be policy changes and legal legislation can change regarding minimum wage, but it could also be any of those other outside forces. It could be just the nature of the marketplace. Could be, for example, Chick-fil-A just announced that they are going to. That they used to have a policy of no antibiotics in chicken. So if they were buying chicken, they had to be untainted by antibiotic chemicals. So no chemicals injected into the chicken. They've relaxed that requirement, and so now they will accept chickens who have been given antibiotics as long as they do not have any sort of human interaction. And I didn't really get into the details on that, but there was some public outcry. If you look at Wendy's, floated the notion of having flexible pricing, and I'm going to guess that I think even people were calling it surge pricing, and I think the immediate reflexive response was like, "Oh, Uber only raises prices to ridiculous levels for." So the market spoke back very quickly, clapped back. But this would have been a case where maybe they were going to try a different way of pricing. And what if flexible pricing at a fast food restaurant took off and that had another impact on their competitors? So it changed the terrain a little bit. That would have been interesting. And then that has an impact on who comes out ahead if they're not planning. If McDonald's has to pay $20 minimum wage, I don't know if Wendy's, I've never seen Wendy's mentioned anywhere. But if the smaller player can then enter the game because they've knocked the bigger players down a peg or two with the minimum wage requirements based on the monolith size, it's an interesting external force affecting a marketplace, a free marketplace, by the way. So I've been focusing on that, on the fast food stuff, but this applies to anything, right? There are regular. Well, first of all, the ban on TikTok will be interesting. I guess we'll see what unfolds over the course of the next almost a year. The fact that there's been such an outcry, and that ironically TikTok was appealing to their many users to write your congressperson and tell them that we don't have any influence over you. That's not too far from the truth. The fact that TikTok has that committed audience that is dependent on TikTok. TikTok is their monolith. Like, we do all of our business on TikTok, even though the rev share model, I believe, is better on YouTube than TikTok. But the take home, once you've established a dependency on a particular monolith, so a big giant player in a particular space, things that impact that monolith and their ability to service you, to provide you with either an outlet for your creative angst, with a path to revenue generation, with whether it's directly through your content or whether it's as a marketing tool for some other goods or services you're selling, whatever the case may be, when that monolith and its stability are threatened in any way by outside regulation, outside forces, all the things I mentioned and more, then it's time to reflect on whether depending on a monolith is a good idea. So we're coming to an end, strangely enough. The possible mitigations. So this is the part where we say, what can we do about it? So first and most important, understanding risk and exposure in general by way of a particular monolith you might depend on. So what are my exposure? When I depend completely on TikTok to talk about my first job at McDonald's, and both of those things might be going away, have I considered my exposure in committing to both and depending on both and with this new information? So a particular monolith that I depend on might directly or indirectly go away or change circumstances that impact me directly. These are arguably critical things to ponder. Now, I will tell you, as a 15-year-old in high school, I was not immediately considering, well, what happens if I get fired from McDonald's and I need to have another job lined up by the next day? Did I do that? No. But these are different times. And there are opportunities that people can at least investigate early. So digitally, right? Online, whatever. Side hustle is now, I think, in the dictionary with a real definition. The job that will soon be your main job. This may be this may be difficult if interconnections, perhaps behind the scenes, that might introduce those unintended consequences are actually taking place. So, for example, the TikTok is quote unquote fine. It's the problem seems to be with their parent company ByteDance and the United States government, how they view ByteDance. I personally think TikTok as a platform is unhealthy, so I'm more concerned with the impact on public health. But it's not immediately apparent to the TikTok revenue generation scheme that there might be some like geopolitical considerations, privacy concerns, and whether information sharing is taking place, whether there's an influence campaign from a foreign actor, whatever it is, whatever all the scuttlebutt. And I'm not disagreeing or poo-pooing or diminishing those. I'm just saying that those things probably don't enter the picture when someone is saying, I'm going to go all in on TikTok. So considering these risks is sometimes about the platform, but it's sometimes about the stuff that you don't really completely because it's not necessarily visible, you don't necessarily understand some of the risks and exposures. It could be the fact that, well, I'm going to work at McDonald's, not when the minimum wage changes. That wasn't their doing, but they get impacted by. So there's like an external force that you may not have planned for. And again, when you're 15 or 16, probably not looking at that stuff. You might hear about it later, like when you get laid off. Spread the dependencies around. This is not always easy. Could I sign up for a secondary carrier for my internet service? Presently a Cox residential customer. Would it be easy to do here in Vegas? No. CenturyLink is, I think, a bit player. They are a second option. I don't believe Comcast is available here. But as far as wired cable service, you're pretty much Cox or CenturyLink, and CenturyLink never gets good reviews. And then lower bandwidth, generally not as well regarded. CenturyLink does offer fiber in some like square blocks downtown, I think. So that was always their claim to fame. Could I get a backup service provider wired? I could look at DSL. I think it's not easy to come by. I don't even know if the building that I'm living in is wired for twisted pair telephony, which DSL sort of depends on. Then I would have to look at like T-Mobile residential wireless. I can't remember what the product is called. It's a 5th generation box that connects to a cellular network. Right, so you can look at some backups and alternates just in case, but at the end of the day, those choices are not always there. If you're in high school and you can't get a job at McDonald's because you aren't going to make $20 an hour, where else could you look? Can you work at the library? Can you work at a bookstore? Do they even have those anymore? Can you work at a shoe store? Can you work at, what kinds of jobs don't require skills and experience because you don't really have much of that at 16? Are you considering that now? So spreading the dependencies around away from monoliths and towards other up-and-comers or smaller, less noticeable, not quite players in the monolith game. If you can establish your own, what we call an approved vendor list of sorts, like here's a list of the places I could work, here are the list of places I could get food, here are the places I could buy cars, get internet service, what kind of phones, all kinds of opportunities that you have to make changes if needed. So the approved vendor list, if you're building something, you will have an AVL, we call it. Like, okay, we can purchase if you have a McDonald's AVL, we can buy the onions from these 200 farmers around the country or around the world probably. If you have an AVL, approved vendor list, and one of the vendors becomes unavailable or, whoops, that monolith is shrinking or got taken off the board, you already have your approved or what you might at that point call an alternate vendor list. So you can go down to the next one. Okay, I can't use Cox. I can use my approved vendor list has another entry. Whoops, CenturyLink kind of sucks. But anyway, knowing that you actually at least have options. So another way of looking at the AVL is the alternate vendor list. And if you have this list, then you will have already pondered alternatives. And so spreading around your risk and your exposure and having other opportunities should the risk and exposure become too great, or if the monolith tips over, you will be doing yourself a service early. You'll be prepared, as scouts might be. Consider non-monolithic approaches. Maybe we can call these startups or smaller players, not always the big giant player in the room. So maybe drive by the McDonald's to the mom and pop food truck selling awesome hamburgers. Like if you're in Vegas, you should go to Fuku Burger, which started out as a what is it called? Fuku Burger food truck, owned by Colin Fukunaga. So I think they have three or four locations now. Delightful, delicious burgers. So drive by the McDonald's and go to a smaller player that's not a monolith. It's a different type of marketplace, a different participation. Obviously, I'm talking about food here more, but go for the Linux phone. Go for the alternate service provider. I don't know about Starlink. That's a different headache. But don't always focus on Twitter. Don't feel like you got to stick with Facebook and Instagram. Don't only do TikTok, right? Start publishing your own. So consider non-monolithic options, whether it's in technology, whether it's in social networking platforms, news sources, political parties, although that one's almost a lost cause at this point. So there are many ways to reduce your own exposure to the impacts of unexpected changes to your monoliths, your favorite players in whatever space we're talking about here: food, drink, internet service providers, geopolitics, aircraft manufacturing, you name it. Consider alternative choices or testing out the newcomers. We have a whole class of strange people like myself, early adopters, that we are willing to try out the new thing and then face some of the, when you have a new product, version 1 comes out of a little upstart and it doesn't quite work. And I already did an episode on what reviewers can say to their audience. So I'm looking at you, Rabbit and Humane, with the Rabbit R1 and the Humane Pin. They're version 1 products, totally new product space. Both promised a lot, delivered very little, but version 1 is version 1. Personally, I think the Humane Pin hardware is kind of interesting. They could have opened up the platforms and allowed their early adopter public with development skills to proactively build feature sets and great examples and whatever. Decisions were made, but people who are early adopters are going to see the value in the non-monolithic approach, the open to community contributions, open to communicating and being somewhat transparent about their products and their developments, and maybe open sourcing some things and adding real value, not relying completely on the third phase of their impoopification timeline, totally raking in profits for their shareholders. Not that profit is bad, but considering other options rather than always going with the easy, the classic, nobody gets hired for choosing Microsoft. That doesn't enable a diverse marketplace. And what ends up happening, and we barely even touched on the unexpected outside forces. What happens when you always go for the popular one is you don't have enough diversity to fend off those external forces or even internal problems to mitigate that risk that you're putting yourself at risk by selecting the same option that everybody else has. So if that one option goes south, same with having immune system diversity in a pandemic circumstance. So the more diversity you have in immunologically, the more options you have to fend off or to develop different types of immunity or who knows what. I mean, I'm not an immunologist, but the point is, if everybody goes with the same thing, you all will have the same risk profile to deal with. So I'm a fan of early adopting. It's one thing to consider, at least as a plan B, or at least in parallel, like make your side gig trying out a new type of cell phone, maybe a Linux phone or maybe get a feature phone that does texting and not much else. And it'll be interesting to see how Uber and DoorDash and all these other, you got to have a cell phone. But I do. But it's not the right smartphone from the right one of the two players. Pick a monolith. And you're like, well, I got an old Nokia branded phone. Now it's made by somebody else. HPC or something. Interesting times. I think the more we depend on, this is my opinion, the more we depend on monoliths, the more we fuel them with our money and our attention, and we stop being curious about other options and other possibilities, and without paying special attention to the risk that we take on for ourselves by depending completely on the likes of Google or Apple or Amazon. How many times has Amazon screwed you over? How many times has Google killed off a product that you thought you could depend on? How many times has Apple surprised you with a policy change? Like, oh, now I'm not allowed to do this because somebody at Apple told me that. Obviously, the minimum wage thing at McDonald's will be an interesting one to watch. And I've barely scratched the surface of the surface. But it's something to think about how you not only interact with, but depend upon these ever more powerful monolithic players in a particular marketplace. It could be any segment, could be any type of market. Again, food, technology, transportation, medical, whatever it is. What happens when those either fail or change to your detriment or become less useful in general, or they merge and things change, the circumstances that change and you're not prepared for it. Production by a street. When these circumstances change, it's important to realize that monoliths are not all they're cracked up to be. And that is the take-home message from this week's episode of FFS Talk. So what do you think? This is probably, all of the topics I've had for all of the shows, all the episodes, are worthy for additional conversation. So when the FFS Talk website launches, I'll have to make that clear that if people want to come on and have a conversation, I'm not really interested in debating so much because I don't know that there's a hard and fast correct answer, but there are certainly different ways of viewing different things. And my doing shows as a solo monologue, a monolithic monologue, doesn't offer different viewpoints. So you're only getting my own in this and previous episodes of various things. So conversation's good. We'll see if we can make that happen. We'll see how the summer goes. Summer of 2024, the long hot summer of Vegas. Actually, it starts to get cooler after the middle of July. That's what I hear. Past 10 years, that's kind of been true. Maybe not so true in the last 2. So we'll see. Maybe a topic for next week. Thank you so much for listening. Consider which monoliths you depend on. What would happen if they went away or changed drastically on you, much to your surprise and chagrin. Don't forget buymeacoffee.com/DanHugo, Ko-fi.com, ko-fi.com/DanHugo. Links to other shows, other programs, the possibility of, but not the requirement to buy me a coffee if you like. Everything I work on is powered by coffee. On that note, later.